Hello, and welcome back, or welcome to the Yogi Roth Show. So excited for today's guest. I think he's going to impact you in ways far beyond what you may think coming in to this podcast episode. Our guest's name is Mark Speckman. Coach Speckman is known as an innovator in college football. He invented the fly sweep. Yeah, that play that everybody runs in Pop Warner, high school, college, and the NFL. He's the guy that came up with it, and everybody's been using it for decades. Well, what makes Mark Speckman even more impactful is, to me, the philosophy he's lived his life with. He lives by this phrase, figure it out. And I've talked about figure it outness a lot in terms of if there's people I want to work with, collaborate with, hire, etc., you got to have an element of figure it outness. We talk about it with high school quarterbacks at the Elite 11 all the time. Can you just figure it out? You know, there's no necessary guidebook to everything in life. Can you figure it out? Well, Mark Speckman has had to figure it out his entire life. He was born with no hands and 9 toes. Clearly not the easiest way to begin your life as an athlete. But he figured it out. He became an All-American linebacker. He became an incredible head coach. And now he's continually coaching at UC Davis under Dan Hawkins. Overall, Coach Speckman, I think, will impact all of you as parents, if you're bullied, coaches, if you're an innovator. I just think he drops so many gems in this conversation. So we're going to get right to it. In the meantime, make sure you go to yogiroth.com and subscribe to the How Great Is Ball newsletter. Every week, I'm going to give you 3 takeaways from college football, things that I don't think you've heard anywhere else. So check it out. Let me know what you think, and we'll keep it moving. I'm getting out of the way. Here's one of the most inspirational individuals I've ever met, ever had a chance to talk with, Coach Mark Speckman. As you heard about in the open, really excited about today's guest. Cannot wait to talk to Coach Speckman. Coach, first and foremost, thanks for joining the show.
Oh, my pleasure.
Yeah, really honored to have you. I want to first and foremost take you back to the University of Pittsburgh, because I remember being 18 years old, 19 years old, and all of a sudden I hear about the fly sweep, and I hear about we have the man, the magician, this amazing storyteller and innovator in our building. And that was when I was playing, and it happened to be you. What do you remember about that experience?
Well, I remember flying into Pittsburgh. I knew Walt Harris. He was at the University of Pacific, which was close to Merced High, where I was, and we had a great team at Merced, and we really were about the only guys really running the fly at the time. And he would stand there. He was recruiting, and he would stand and watch it and ask a lot of questions. Then he had me come up and talk to the staff, and they tried it for a while, but most people don't stick with it because they don't. If it doesn't work, that's the first thing to go. And when he got to Pittsburgh, he called me and flew me out and we hung out for a few days, and it was great. He wanted to get, I remember Larry Fitzgerald was there, and he wanted to get him the ball. And I know they played Texas A&M the first game, and they swept really well. And again, I don't know if they kept with it, but running back coach who just got hired was Dino Babers, and J.D. Burkhart and Walt. And Walt and I have stayed, I haven't talked to him for a while, but we stayed pretty friendly. I really always admired Walt.
Well, he's definitely going to love the fact that you're coming onto this podcast, and Walt's going to be coming on this year as well, nice. Which is the goal, just to ask your old coach a bunch of fun questions.
Right.
But as I've been in this profession for a little while now, what I'm most curious about is you're an innovator in the game. Very rarely, I think, do we hear about the beginning of innovation. We celebrate innovation when it's innovative and everybody's heard about it. So how does this begin for you to create this style of football that we see now on every level, NFL, college, of course, high school, but in Europe, in the CFL, it's literally everywhere. So day one, when you're trying this thing out, do you have any idea it's going to be as big as it is? And how do you even begin to add success upon success?
I had no idea it was going to be successful. I had no idea, period, that I could coach offense. I played linebacker at Azusa Pacific, and I became a head coach at 26, and I had been an assistant with a guy named Phil Moss, and his assistant was Roger Sugimoto. And they had heard about La Mosca, the fly, because Gene Beck was running it at Delano High School in California in the 50s. And it was basically a wrinkle. It was basically... it wasn't the offense. It was just something you did part-time. It was 4 plays, 1 formation. And I took that, so I didn't invent it, but I took the 4 plays, 1 formation and turned it into a full-fledged offense. And simply because I believed in it, I knew it, and kids would make mistakes, and I go, that looks pretty good. Let's put that in. And then nobody ever told me I shouldn't, and nobody said no. So I was the head coach. I could do it, and we just kind of put it together, and it just generally worked. It was, and I think the principles from a defensive coach's perspective are, I just want to do all the things on offense that I hated to see on defense, and that's just so it was trial and error. And we had a saying, like a kid would make a mistake, and I say, don't worry about it. They're going to draw a card up, they'll practice that, but that might work, And so there was that what if, what if we did this? It was a big part of what I wanted my staff to do with the offense.
I love that phrase, what if? What if we did this? Mm-hmm. When you think back on your life, and we'll dive into it, but is that part of you is also of what if? Like, what if I could play high school football? Right. What if I can, I love in your book, which we'll promote all the links, Figure It Out. It's a hilarious book, by the way, for those of you that have not read it yet. You can check it out in the show notes. But is Figure It Out, obviously that's a phrase of yours, but, find a way, piece it together. Is that kind of how your brain, you think, was trained? So then you can come 20, 30 years later and all of a sudden create this new version of offense that hadn't been seen.
I really think it is. I always, like our coaches would say, okay, you got to catch the ball with your hands, and I'd stand there. I wasn't going to make it, like say, hey, what about me? I would just go, okay, I better figure out how to catch the ball. And, when you tackle, you got to grab cloth. I'm going, okay, that's not going to work for me. So everything was always, I was there and I was listening, and then I would figure it out. I was doing rugby tackling before anybody was doing rugby tackling because my arms weren't long enough to get around people. If I tried to tackle the old-fashioned way, I'd have gotten killed. But I went in low and my arm, I could get people around people's legs, and I could make a lot of tackles. And I learned how to catch a ball, and I learned how to throw a ball. And so there's a lot of, but I do think that I tell a story about brushing my teeth. Like I came up with 5 different ways of putting toothpaste on a toothbrush. Most people don't have to come up with 5 different ways. And so I think maybe there is a seed there that kind of germinated into some of the other things. And obviously sometimes I'm completely baffled by something, but usually I can figure it out.
Okay, so you're born with no hands and 9 toes.
Right.
Your mom, I want to learn more about her. She's fascinating when you dive into your book. What's your childhood like? And paint a picture for people that aren't familiar with your path.
Well, very lower middle class, upper lower class. Just working class people in the Bay Area, always struggling to get by financially. I had an older brother who was great, and I had a younger brother who was great. But they just kind of threw me in, and it was like, hey, it's your turn to go sweep the porch. I said, well, how am I, go sweep the porch? And there was a genius in what they did. It was my turn. I had to do it. And, my brother went to parochial school, and I have nothing against parochial school, but, he was in the 2nd grade. I was in kindergarten, and they said, we can't have Mark in kindergarten. We can't take care of him. And so my mom just took all of us out of Catholic school and put us in public schools. And, she was just that, she was very determined that nobody was ever going to slight me. And I don't think she was protective, though. They let me ride bikes. They let me, I'm doing crazy stuff all the time. And so there was a genius to what they did. They just kind of threw me in and never, my mom always said, hey, the only thing you can't do is climb mountains because you can't hold on the rope. And, when I got to Azusa, I took a climbing class just to kind of spite her. But, she was marvelous. And my dad did a real good job, too. But I think my mom was really the backbone of that.
Yeah. What do you think, the form versus essence to me is a really fun conversation, right? The form, you're a football coach, you played, right? 6'2", 235, he averages 7 tackles a game, he's amazing. Or he's a running back, and he's averaging 100. That's the form of that individual versus the essence of that individual. So I'm curious for you, I'm sure you got defined via your form.
Yeah.
How did you develop and find and define your essence so you could go and rappel from mountaintops or catch a football or catch a baseball, as you describe in your book? Because I think in this part of society, now you're coaching young men here at UC Davis, form versus essence, I think, is a big deal for this next generation.
It is. So many kids don't want to stand out. They don't want to be different. They want to, blend in and, hey, you do your thing, I'll do my thing. And, I just never had that opportunity. And it was like, okay, if I don't dive in, then I'm gonna be sitting in my room, So I would never do anything in public unless I'd really practice. I mean, I dribbled a basketball hundreds of times and shot hundreds of baskets before I went out and said, okay, I'm going to go out for the 8th grade team. And I'd played a lot of baseball before I, played noon baseball with the kids in junior high. But I also got real confident, So it's almost like, well, why couldn't I do that? And it was always like, well, I'll figure out. Like handbrakes on a bike, I'd flip the brakes up and ride and then kind of push it down, and it worked, But and then some things I just wasn't very good at, I mean, I could try all I wanted to play golf, but I was always going to be really, really average. And so I go, I don't, but I think everybody does that, But I got really good at racquetball, and so that, so I was able to figure out a way to play that, and it's just. I was confident. I think that nobody. I think it's like people. I think I walk in places people don't know what to do, and so I would walk into. I remember getting my teaching credential, and they wanted to fingerprint me, and I just looked at the lady. She looked at me, and she went, "Okay," and I said, "Thanks," and like she didn't say no, so I guess I can teach, and nobody said no to going into rock climbing, and. Once I learned, like, I'm not going to really kill myself, and, there's some good teachers, and they got excited. A lot of people get, when they see me, they get excited, like, well, hey, mate, you really think you can do that? Let's work on that. So it's been an adventure, for sure. But it is, I'm always going to be defined by how I look, and it bothers me, but I've come to an acceptance.
Some of my favorite moments, and I walked on, was, my form was not big enough, right, for Power 5 Division I school, or wasn't fast enough, or I remember being told by that from everyone from coaches to parents to family, don't do it. But some of my favorite memories in life are when I got to talk to myself. Hey, you got this. You can do this. Or I would broadcast my games in the backyard. Roth, top of the key, 3, 2, 1, jump shot, good, right? What were the talks like with yourself? What was your self-talk like when you were growing up? And then you start to have success. I mean, you become an All-American as a linebacker. I mean, it's not like you didn't play. Mm-hmm. So I'd love to know the basis, because this whole podcast is trying to find out one question, the answer to what does it mean to be human? Mm-hmm. And I think it starts with our self-talk. So I want to know what yours was like growing up and then through your stages.
I think early on it was like, I don't want anybody to make fun of me, and then I was I was blessed to be fairly. I mean, I'm a pretty good athlete. I was fairly quick. I was not big, but I was good enough. But I think when I got into high school, it was really like, I'll show these guys. I had a chip on my shoulder that was huge. Like it was almost a rage, almost like everybody's doubting me, and I know I can do this. Just give me a chance. And then it became confidence. Like, okay, you've done this before. You can do it again, and there's nothing you can't do. You'll figure it out. I mean. Just give me some time and I'll figure it out. And but I remember, like in high school, man, I'd go out to practice and my hair was on fire. I was going to, I just felt like I had to prove myself. And then you want to be invisible. I mean, I really can. And I've never met the guy with the Seahawks and Griffin but I really feel like I pretty much know the guy, because I'm sure he's sick of it. He just wants to be left alone and just go out and just people celebrate the fact that he's a phenomenal athlete. But that thing about form, he's always going to be the linebacker with one hand, and he seems to be handling it way better than I would have at that age. I mean, I was in college. It just never dawned on me it was a big deal. Like it was just like parents would bring their kids after a game and say, "Hey, I want my kids to meet you." I'm going, "Why?" Then as you get older, you go, "Oh, I get it. They're trying to show their kids that things are possible." And and then gradually you start to learn, hey, my story's pretty unique, and I have a responsibility to share it, and that's kind of was a turning point.
What was, if you don't mind sharing, did you have a low point when you were a teenager, or when you were in college, when you were like, man, like, will you just stop defining me by my form, or whatever it was for you, if it was?
Well, one of the things that happens is the more success you have, the more attention you draw. So you're trying to be invisible and just play college football, and then you're I remember like the headline in the paper, no-handed linebacker. I go, come on, you can do better than, like, really? But, I just think I really had goals. I really felt like I could, I really wanted to play college football. I really liked playing the trombone. I was in the band, and I was so busy doing stuff, that I just, I really didn't. I mean, there's some social things that really, in high school that were tough, and there's some moments, but for the most part, once people got to know me, it was no big deal. But it was always that break in the ice. So every new job, I'm going to get interviewed, and every time I change something, once I'm there for a while, everybody gets used to me. And it's no big deal. So again, you have to come to learn to understand that it's it's a big deal to people.
What do you think about this generation? Because you're coaching it, and I say that and trying to make the parallel to what you have gone through in your life. Of now we're in a different era. Maybe it's not always at UC Davis student athletes, right. But you go to Clemson, you go to SC, you go to some of these big schools, and kids are defined by whether it's their last name and the history of their family, or whether it's what they did in high school. I mean, they're painted into, you are this. You're the 5-star DB. Why are you not starting day one and locking dudes down? And what I believe, and I talk about in this season on this podcast with psychologist Dr. Michael Gervais with the Seahawks, you're familiar with him, about depression and anxiety in college sports, specifically football. I think it's at an all-time high. I see these kids as 5-star recruits at the opening in the Elite 11, and there's supposed to be so many great things. In the fall, we all fall because the game says we're done with you. I think their fall is just going to be further because of the pressure. So for someone who now speaks for a living while coaching, you motivate for a living how you live and also how you present to people. You're sharing clearly your story. How do you view and how do you talk to kids about dealing with the pressures that they have? Because you felt them. Yeah. When Twitter didn't exist, but I would bet what you felt is similar to what kids feel now with how people are trying to paint them and define their form.
I feel a little bit bad for kids today just because I think the social media thing is such a blessing and a curse. There's a lot of good things about it, but there's tons of bad. And, when you start defining yourself by how many followers you have and how many retweets, and how many stars you have, and who's really giving out these stars, and who are these people? And I feel like I think being a high school coach is tough today with all these other people hanging around, but with that being said, I think those are the things that kids are going to have to figure out, and most of them do. And I find the kids today are not much different than the kids were 30 years. I mean, they're semi-lost. They want to get found. I think the kids, are there's a lot of smart kids out there, a lot of good kids out there, and so I remain fairly hopeful, personally. But I just think that everybody wants to prejudge, like, well, you're going to be you're the best hitter, so you'll bat fourth, and you're terrible, so you're bat ninth, and everybody wants to put you in the lineup. And and nobody's ever right. The draft is always wrong. The 5-star recruits are always wrong. And it's like does anybody notice that all these people that are wrong, but yet we put so much stock in them, and that's how I always felt like I was always going to be the last guy picked. I don't think I've ever interviewed for a job that I got first. I mean, I was second choice sometimes or third choice, but I've never. And I think people would, I'm sure when that door closed, the committee went, I don't know, I don't know. And because I was way out there different, not only from a schematic standpoint, but specifically for the way I looked. And I'm not saying that's for sure, but I think you got to deal with that and just go, okay, I'm different. And now what? What are you going to do about it?
Yeah. So what would you tell, let's just say there's a 16-year-old listening now who's told he's this, or told he's that, or a 22-year-old who's told he's this or that, or a 30-year-old who thinks he should be this or thinks he should be that. Give him a tool. I mean, you've been there. You've had dark times, bright times, known as one of the most innovative guys in the game of football. But how would you advise someone if they came up to you and said, I'm sick of being told who I am. It's not me.
Well, I always think it's never as good as you think it is. It's never as bad as you think it is. I mean, I think we really, we're either, 100 degrees or we're freezing. And generally you're most comfortable about 75, and I just think that I just kind of knew I liked football and I was going to coach. I probably needed to be a teacher because nobody told me to go be a GA, or I didn't have any idea what to do. But just getting it, I mean, when I got into college, my parents were just amazed. They're so happy and proud, but they didn't go to college. And when I got a job, I mean, it was like when I got a job, I was going, wow, that's really cool. I really think that I think you have to dwell on what you've done. There's some positive things. And so many people say, yeah, I was just a second stringer. Or, well, that's pretty cool. I tell kids, hey, we could have a team of 300 if they'd let us here at Davis. We only have so many spots. You got a spot. That's pretty special. And some people don't. I mean, you're playing, third string at USC. That's pretty special. And you're the backup tackle for the 49ers. That's pretty special. But I think we're trained. I think we have to understand that we're trained to be unhappy. We're never happy with our status. We're never happy with our job or our pay. We're kind of trained to keep moving forward and higher. People always say, well, what's your next job? Or, when you're going to go big time? Or, is this a stepping stone? And I think that's really, I would just say, try to just do the best you can and see what happens, because it's amazing how far I've gotten without ever having a plan. I just did my deal.
I think that's fascinating because you've had so much success. High school coach, crushed it. Willamette, crushed it. Everywhere you've been, right? You're a Hall of Famer at Menlo. You're an All-American player, known all over football circles. Do you still feel, though, are you a guy who has that chip on his shoulder? Are you the guy that is going to prove? Or was there a moment where you said, I'm just going to compete to be the best me? And what was that transition like, if that's a reality? And if not, why not?
Well, I think as if you have a chip on your shoulder, and there's nothing wrong with having a chip on your shoulder, except it could crush you if it's a boulder. And I think when you get older, you kind of have a nice smooth stone on your shoulder that you can bring it out every now and then when you need it, when you got to get your hair on fire. And there's times where I do that. And then there's times where you go, I just don't need to fight that anymore. What am I trying to prove? What's my purpose? And I think that's really, my purpose is to be the best assistant coach for Dan Hawkins that I can. My purpose is to get their running backs to play well. My purpose is to recruit good kids and represent this university. I love it. It's a service job. So I think you got to just kind of, I think so many people are so busy getting their next job, they're not doing a good job at their job. I was doing a great job at Lawrence University, and Coach Hawkins called and offered me a chance to come back to California, which was awesome. But it wasn't like I was knocking down doors. I was having a ball, and I just think, as tried as it sounds, just do the very best you can where you're at. If you're that 30-year-old that doesn't feel like you're being successful, because you're lots more successful than a lot of people. And I look back at friends and people, and we're all doing the best we can, and I just think that, like I said, it's never as good as you think, it's never as bad as you think.
Did you ever have a moment of like, yeah, I arrived, like I did it? Like, was it when you were maybe named an All-American, or you got featured as the Coach of the Year and Kirk Herbstreit's voicing over your story?
Well, that was pretty cool, to be honest with you, but no, I had never felt that way. I've always felt like, and I think part of it was like I was always felt like an imposter on the offensive side of the ball, because I never really played offense that much, a little bit in high school, but so I was always like, these guys are going to figure us out, I was always like, geez, what do they, when they figure us out? And so I think part of my motivation was fear, like I got to keep this thing going. I got to keep, coming up with stuff. But once you started having fun with it, you turned that in from fear, like, oh wow, we're gonna, I'm gonna get fired, I'm gonna lose, or they're gonna, we're never gonna gain a yard, to, hey, this could be kind of cool, and so as you got more experience, it became more fun. But I've never felt like I've arrived, every year is new. I always joke like, hey, someday I'll do it right. Someday I'll do it from day one to the end of the year. I won't make any mistakes with kids or with the way I treat people or X's and O's. But that's what's fascinating about this job. And that's why you see guys that hang around so long, because it's a ton of fun.
I'd love your advice on parenting. You know, I mean, I think that when we see young kids, we see an innocence in them. And then there's that one moment where you're watching them, and let's just say a group of friends laugh at them. Maybe it's the older kids saying, hey, get out of our group. We're playing on the beach with our beach ball. This isn't part of you. Your father, and you were a child, and you've probably been on both circles. What would you tell parents to kids who want to protect, but you know that, you know, the figure it out element might be the best thing for them?
That is tough. You know, I mean, when I had my kids, you know, you would just, you know, you hovered and you go, oh my God, he's going to fall down the stairs, or, you know, don't climb that tree, or, you know, I wonder if that's a good influence on him as a friend. And, you know, ultimately they're going to figure it out, and ultimately they're going to fall, and ultimately they're going to split their lip. And you just hope that they don't do anything serious, you know. I mean, I always kind of picture it as like a landmines, and, you know, the kids are running through the field just going, please don't blow yourself up. And most of them don't, but some do, you know, and then sometimes they blow themselves up and get back up and become really good people. And again, you know, I just think, you know, it's interesting because a lot of times people will call me and say, hey, my sister had a child and they don't have a hand, or, you know, what should I do? And or, you know, when I was up at Willamette, there's a girl that, you know, was born without the bottom, you know, her legs were off at the knees and her arms were off at the elbows. And, you know, she was in kindergarten like this, and I walked in and it was really interesting. And I said, well, you know, does she have any prosthetics? And they said, well, her legs, and she has good legs. And, you know, the prosthetic legs are very advanced. You can run in the Olympics with them. But prosthetic arms, you know, no matter what people say, are not good yet. And, you know, those mechanical hands you see they're not strong enough. There's no tactile sensation. There's just some issues still. But I just put some change on the counter, and I said, can you pick the money up? And she could. And I said, can you write your name? And she could. And she had figured out how to do it with her arms. And I said, you know, what kind of games do you like to play? And she said, well, I like, you know, the dolls. And I said, can you know, she had a doll. She said, well, how can you dress the doll? Oh yeah, I can dress the doll. And I just told the parents, don't worry about it. You know, I mean, she's fine. You're good. Let her go. And it ain't going to be easy. But it hurts as a parent. And I give my parents a ton of credit because, you know, I mean, I've got scars all over. But they just let me keep going. And, you know, I'd say, hey, I want to go off of football. Go do it. You know, I want to do, you know, everything I wanted to do. They said, yeah, go for it, except climbing mountains. But, you know, I think even parents that have perfectly normal kids have the same emotions. And, you know, safety is an illusion. You know, ships are safe in a harbor, but that's not what they're made for. You know, they got to go out. And, it's heartbreaking when they fail, but that you know, I think back to my life, it's those failures that made me. I've learned a lot more losing than I ever did winning, and you know, you really don't know about happiness until you've had, you know, sorrow, and that's really true. And so, you know, most kids are resilient. I was very resilient, but I think all kids are. They'll bounce back, and you know, they got to be tough. You know, we got a lot of smart kids in the world. We need tough kids.
So what do you think it means then to be human?
Well, I really think that it means bouncing back. You know, I mean, it is being master of your own fate. You know, and controlling how you react. Kind of like Viktor Frankl talks about. You know, I mean that's our choice. You know, I mean, when people stare at me, I can get angry or I can smile or, you know, I can choose my reaction. I don't have to let what they do to me, you know, ruin my day or make my day. I just got to. I mean, I mean, if a camera crew followed me, it would be, you know, hilarious and sad, because so many crazy things happen in the course of a day. And I'm just used to it, you know. But if anybody ever travels with me, they go, "You're going to put up with that," or you know, wow. But I think that, you know. When somebody has sight and loses their sight, their hearing improves, you know. And we have all this ability, we just don't use it because we don't have to use it. You know, this figure it out thing is my way of life. You don't have to do it as much. I do, so I'm better at it than you are. But if you had to, you could. And so I just think, you know, being human is understanding that, you know, we choose how we're going to react, and that we really don't have as many limits as we put on ourselves. that most of our bars are just shadows, and we can do a lot more than we think we can.
What is you write about it in your book, but I'm not sure if this is the same answer, but curious what your figured out moment was when you were like, okay, I'm just gonna have to find a way here, and that became a uncompromising principle for you.
Well, I remember going to junior college. I remember the night before the first practice, I was scared to death. And I almost quit. I almost wasn't going to go to practice the next day. And I came, and really what I was worried about is who's going to tie my stuff, because I can't tie my shoes. And in high school, all my buddies did. They all knew me. They were, so I just walked through the locker room, everybody tied my stuff, and everybody liked me, and everybody, I had my friends, and so it was no big deal. But I was going into a situation where I didn't know anybody, and these guys were all college football players. And how's that going to look walking in when you're 18? You can't tie your shoes. And I remember, I'm not doing it. I'm just not going to do that. And it's humiliating. And then I thought, well, if I want to play, I can play. I think I can play. If I get my stuff on, I can play. So I remember walking in, looking at the stuff, and well, maybe I can tie it. And I go, and then so I learned a lesson that I've got to. So one of the big aha moments was asking for help and just saying, can you tie my shoes? And the guy looked at me and goes, you're kidding. And I go, no. And he goes, all right. Then the girdle pads and the pants, and it got a little weird. So that was one. And then another one was when I used to have to wear hooks, and I hated them. And I was the third youngest person in the United States to get fitted for hooks. And so I was kind of a little bit of a poster child for University of California, San Francisco, and they would bring me in. And about 3 years after I was born, the thalidomide hit Europe. And so I remember talking in front of German doctors and being, like I would say, pick up a square peg and put in a square hole with my hooks. But I remember being about 14 and saying, I'm not wearing these anymore. And all the doctors, and said, oh, you have to. I go, no, I'm not. You can make them. I'm not wearing them. I told my parents, you can buy them. I'm not wearing them. And I wasn't a defiant kid at all, but I had made up my mind. And that was another lesson, like, hey, the experts aren't always right, So sometimes my gut was telling me what was right, and I was going to go with it. I knew it. I knew it in my soul that I was way better served not wearing hooks than wearing them. So those are two moments that I can think of where I said, I have to make a decision, and this is how we're going to go, and for me to reach my potential.
That's amazing because, in your book and in some of your talks online, you've talked about the figure it out. So you referenced one in this conversation of, okay, you got to sweep the porch. Okay, how am I going to do that? I'm going to figure it out. And here your two examples are of one, you figure out that your voice is what you're going to trust, and I'm done with the hooks. And then two is I can't do it all alone. And to me, like, I get the chills hearing that and almost choked up because I think asking for help for someone who has a chip on their shoulder, whether it was born without hands or a walk-on, like, that is a real barrier, I think, for people with chips or with people that are told they're the next great thing. How do you talk to people about asking for help? And we live in a community. Like, a commune is a great word, and that's like the greatest heritages are ones that were based in community, whether it was a refugee camp. I can remember my mom telling me about a refugee camp in the Middle East, or whether it's communities in Latin America that live together. I feel like that moment for me, I'm hearing like you were like, I can't do it alone. Is that accurate? And was that for the first time?
Well, I always had my village, my brothers and my parents and my friends, that I grew up with, and they they knew, we were friends, and so if I asked them to tie my shoes, I go, yeah, sure, no problem, it was, but if you just, if you're in a group and you're 18 years old and you go, hey, would you tie my shoes? People are going, what's wrong with you? You're like, what's your problem? You got an attitude? You too good to tie your own shoes? I remember we had a youth camp, and kids would ask me a million questions, and this kid says, can you tie your shoes? And I said, no. And he goes, I learned how to do that when I was in kindergarten. I go, thanks for the gentle jab. But so how do you, but I kind of liken it to an athlete who's a, big time player, and then he gets hurt and he's on crutches and he needs somebody to help carry his books, and how, but what I found is how helpful people want to be. People are at their best when you ask them for help. It doesn't matter what culture. I've had every culture, every race, every ethnicity, every sex show amazing kindness to me. And I've seen a bunch of boorish behavior too. So I just think that, we all are going to need help to get a job or to, our car broke down. I mean, we all need help from time to time. And sometimes I think we try to John Wayne it and do it ourselves. That's kind of how we're told to do it. And that was a defining moment where I said, you know what, I can't. I was so hell-bent on showing everybody I can do anything that I had to take a step back and say, there's some things I can't do.
I have this phrase that I'm just in love with called we all speak ball. Like wherever you go, you may not know Spanish or French or Hebrew, but you could roll out a ball. Mm-hmm. And football, as you know, is a global game. Right. So I'm curious of your experiences around the power of football and what you think the future of football is.
Well, I'm not doom and gloom about football, but I think we're really hitting a point where we're getting a little silly about it. Parents not letting kids play. And I really think that, we need football. We need it desperately. And we need it for just heal racism. We need it to heal communities. We need it because young men need a proving ground. We don't go on a walkabout. We don't, go out and kill a lion and then we come back and now we're a man. We don't have that in our society. But football is probably one of the toughest. Unless you go in the military, it's probably the toughest thing a kid's going to do in their life. And there's pain and there's fear and there's emotion and they're dealing with adults. And so there's so many positives that and we, I've had concussions. I'm sure you've had concussions, and I'm not saying that, but people have CTE that have never played football, and so there's a lot we need to know about the brain. And I don't know if we're all going to be safe, we'd just be wearing those big balloons around our bodies and not going more than 2 blocks from home, and that's just not the human. That's not who we are. You don't cross oceans and go to the moon being careful, and so I think we need football. I think it's, it's such a positive man-building thing and I think that we need boys to become men, and I think that this is a great way. And there's other ways, but there is the toughness thing and the team thing is a huge part of who we are as a country, in my opinion.
Yeah, it's a tough one. Right? I mean, I love this game. I think it is the only team game in this country. And I think sports teach you everything that, you probably want to teach as a parent, but it's probably hard if you were like, I'm going to teach what it means to show up on time. Breakfast is at 8. Right. That is way harder than, being at practice and going late and seeing what that's like with teammates and coaches and responsibilities. And we know what this game has given us. Right. So I'm worried about the game. Yeah. It's the most rapidly declining sport in this country, yet it's the fastest growing sport in Japan and Brazil. I was just in Israel a year ago, and women are playing, men are playing, tackle, flag. I mean, it's all over the place. So I think it's at a unique moment right now. And I'd be curious what you say for someone who's coached at every level. What do you say to young coaches? I like the targeting rule because I think it's going to save the game. Yeah. And I think the young coaches are the ones that need to teach it in a way that you're teaching it currently. Coach Hawk is teaching it and others are teaching it. But what do you say to young professionals in the game to save the game?
Well, if you don't have targeting, you're probably not going to have football, And I really appreciate what you said about competing to our team because – we don't need to go out and hate our opponent and try to physically hurt them. We want to play football, and we want to tackle them, and we want them to tackle us, and we want to block them. And sometimes you get a good shot, and sometimes you don't. But, not going for the head is probably a smart thing. Rugby's done it for years, and why can't we do that? I just think that, the old-timers are going to say, in my day, we got, I got 3 concussions a day, and, I still passed them, the bar. And you go, okay, I get you. But, and then, you want your son being, hitting the head, because some kids are flying out of control like a missile. And so I think one of the beautiful things about football is playing aggressively on the edge and learning how to do that and not break the rules and not clip and rough the passer. And so I think that we better adapt, or we're going to all be, coaching youth soccer.
Right. A couple more before we let you go. I'm curious, Coach. You've done so many things. What is it that you're seeking? Do you want to go to the NFL and coach up the fly sweep at that level? Do you want just these young men at UC Davis to give back to the game you just eloquently described? What are you seeking right now?
When I got the head job, I was 26 at Livingston High School. I was so on fire that I was going to be at Livingston High School for 40 years. I was going to be the pillar of that community. I would forget to go pick up my paycheck. The third of the month, the secretary would come down and say, "Here's your check. You forgot to get it." I go, "Oh man, they pay me to do this." And then everybody go, "Well, hey, you're pretty good. Why don't you go get a bigger school?" I go, "Oh, okay, I'll go to a bigger school." And then you go to a bigger school, and hey, pretty good. Why don't you go to a bigger school? Okay. And I really never had a plan, and that was it's not good or bad. It's just what it was. And then when the fly thing kind of got going, people say, "Well, it works at your school because, you got fast kids, but, wouldn't work here." And then, well, it works at your school because they're smart kids. And, well, we'll work at Division III. And then, and so part of me was always going, let me at them. Give me somebody, let me coach them, and I'll run this thing down their throat. And then then everybody starts running it. So you go, it really doesn't matter. And, and then you go, well, what is my purpose, And so, I really like it here, Dave. To me, I look at it as a service, as a ministry, this is my role, and I'm very happy with it, And I get to work with really bright kids and help them through a very important time in their lives, just like people help me. I have some great mentors, and so to me, it's a big relay race, And and I'm about ready to pass the baton, I'm getting to the winter of my career, but I feel like the NFL. I did the Canadian League, and it was a ton of fun, but it's dog eat dog, and it just all the good stuff in football is really not in pro football, in my opinion. I mean, the X's and O's are great, but the camaraderie, the lessons, all the teamwork, they try, but it's not the same. It's a business, and so that really didn't excite me, and it was fun. It was a neat life experience. This is a neat level. We have enough money to give scholarships and get kids we deserve to be here. I've done Division III, where basically it's like talking the deer into the back of a pickup without a bullet. You don't have anything to give them, but you just you talk them into it, and that was fun. And I loved high school. I loved probably was the most fun, but I'm not. I would listen to any offers, but I'm not, I like being the head coach. I thought I was a good head coach, but I don't feel a need to be there. I feel really, I love working with Dan Hawkins. I love working with the staff here. I'm pretty content.
Okay, so if you had to finish the sentence, how would you do it? It all comes down to
your attitude. It all comes down to how you handle the cards you're dealt. And some people don't have as good a cards as others. And, only 2% of high school kids go play college football. Doesn't mean the other 98 can't have that great athletic experience. And their cards are going to be dealt to where they're going to do something great in law, or they're going to do something great in business. And, and instead of crying about the cards you're dealt, you amaze people with what you do with the cards you're dealt.
And how do you feel about the word limits?
Don't like it. It's been used on me way too much, and I think even myself, sometimes I've surprised myself by being able to do things, and going, and so once you start doing that, you really become pretty confident, about. I remember I was recruiting, and I knew this coach really well. We had talked football and clinics. We had, I'd been to his school several times. Well, I got there like an hour early, and I was hoping he could see me, and I could, get to the next place. And he was at the track teaching his PE class. I'll never forget this. And he walked up and he goes, "How'd you get here?" And I went, "Well, I took the 530, I explained the highway." And then it dawned on me, he doesn't think I can drive. And I mean, I've known this guy, and I go, man, it just blew my mind. Like, how do you think I got here? I didn't parachute, I mean, it just, those are things that you just have to kind of swallow and just go, you know what, it's okay. But, that's how people look at me.
So some of my favorite things to read are the letters to my younger self, right? You probably get asked that. I get asked that a lot when doing talks. You just described a lot in this conversation, from the chip on your shoulder that was jagged and then became smooth, to obviously your style of coaching and what you've done to the game, and your upbringing. And clearly you don't like the word limits. Knowing what you went through, whether it was the frustrations or the accomplishments, what would you tell yourself as a youngster, as a teenager, when things get hard? Hey, I'm whispering in your ear right now. What would you whisper?
Well, you don't always have to be in a rage. You don't have to be angry. Calm down, take a deep breath, and you're going to finish at some point. A lot of times I just get frustrated because my brother was done in 3 minutes and it took me 20, and I'm just going, just gritting your teeth, going. I tell myself, just relax, man. Just relax. It's all. In due time, it's all going to play out.
I love this. Okay, Coach, how can people get a hold of you, book you for speaking gigs? Yeah. And, of course, your book will be in the show notes.
My Twitter account's at Mark Speckman, and that's probably the best way to do it. I've got a Coach Mark Speckman Facebook, and, right now I'm kind of I love doing the speaking. It's just tough sometimes with the schedule we have here, but that's probably the best way. Just get a hold of me at Mark Speckman at ucdavis.edu. But I would love doing that. I used to really hate it. Now I really enjoy it, and kind of again understand it's part of the story.
I love it. Well, I can't wait to follow your story. I'm going to be calling your guys' game here against Stanford on the Pac-12 network. So thanks for the time, and we'll start nerding out on the football stuff as well. But, Coach, this was an inspirational.
I appreciate that, and really nice talking with you.
I love it. Well, there it is. Coach Speckman, you know how we end these podcasts the same way, that the only limits that we have in life are the ones we set ourselves. Peace.